ideal for people in person to sit through an 8-hour event. So I think that we're starting to see things where sometimes the days aren't consecutive. It'll be a Tuesday and Thursday, or sometimes it's not even consecutive week. It'll be Tuesday for 3 weeks. So there's a number of things that we're starting to see with that in terms of the attendee journey of how things are being scheduled. The opening keynote is super important, but also how do you get people to stay to the end? So having something that also packs a punch towards the end and the middle, giving people a reason within that first 30 seconds to 3 minutes of every session to want to be able to stay and not go to the refrigerator or to be distracted by something else. And the other thing that I think is really challenging, especially as we're moving more towards hybrid, people are trying to figure out how do you connect the in-person attendees with the virtual attendees? And how do you make sure that the virtual experience is also a really powerful
Hello friends, this is Events Demystified, brought to you by Different Events, and I'm your host, Anka. Anybody living and breathing in the virtual event world for the last year and a half, I think it was, has heard of these two acronyms, UI and UX, short for user interface and user experience, and how they're linked to event platforms and the importance of seamless and frictionless user experiences. Thus, these days, the experience designer is the event experience's best friend. And today, we get to talk with John Pistotti, an experienced architect with endless events, and we're going to talk exactly about what that looks like for hybrid events. John works with clients to design solutions for hybrid and virtual events, and his experience includes producing hybrid events for more than 10,000 attendees, live streamed to 30 countries, translated in 4 languages with celebrity keynotes. A few fun facts about John as well. His first job in hospitality was working as banquet staff for parties at the Playboy Mansion, and I can't wait to hear all about that. And later he worked as a sushi chef. I mean, you can't go far one or the other. Which one is going to be? John was also an adventure guide at Sacramento State University, leading trips up to Half Dome in Yosemite, and that's exciting because I've always wanted to do that. He's done midnight snowshoeing in Lake Tahoe. Hey, I've done that too. And mountain biking in Santa Cruz. I have not done that. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to bring him in and talk about all things experience design. And one thing he does these days, he just lays on the beach all day long in San Diego with his wife and 2 kids without one worry in the world. But let's ask him how that works out with the crazy of event. And we'll bring him in right away and find out. Welcome, John, to the show. How are you today? And what are you up to these days? Just bombing on the beach all day long.
Thank you, Anka. Muito mais. And I just want to say, I think that that's the perception of everyone in the remote world, is that, people are just like hanging out, and not that we're on back-to-back Zoom calls for 10 hours a day. So I'm definitely quite lucky. And I think that a number of the things that I've done throughout my career, whether you look at that as like sushi chef or working in banquets or being an adventure guide, actually has a lot to do with experience design and with designing experiences. So I'm really excited to discuss this topic and as it relates to virtual events and hybrid events.
Me too. I mean, you're not just a banquet staff. It's a banquet staff at Playboy Mansion. So let's make sure that everybody knows that and understands.
People always are really excited to hear that. And honestly, it was my first window into events of that scale, where they were completely transforming a space. For instance, like Midsummer Night Dream, and they would build a giant tent, elaborate scenic and lighting and decor and celebrity DJs and all these kind of things. Some of the lessons that I walked away with from that experience had to do with food. The executive chef, Bill Carter, used to always say, smile, it makes the food taste better. And I think about
I like that.
I always like, those are the things, people are like, that's not the story I want to hear about the Playboy Mansion. But
I
for me,
know.
little experiences like that, I think always are the things that I walk away with. Things about like, when we would have to cut food or do certain things to prepare the food, the chef was always like, each piece has to be exactly the same, because it's going to, when it cooks in the oven, they all need to be uniform so that they can all cook at the same amount of time. And I think, again, like, there's so many lessons like that that actually relate back to events, that like everyone needs to have the exact same experience. How do you create a uniform experience across from multiple people? And then also just this idea of like surprise and delight. What are the little things that can become that kind of defining moment for people as they experience an event?
Absolutely. And I love how you bring it all back to event experience, because it is what we want to cover during today's discussion. And I mean, I am though a little bit, curious how you went from that into events. Was it like a change of heart? Was it like, okay, all this food talk is great, but now I want to do something else? Like, I need to hear more the story behind that.
Okay, so a couple of things. First, when I was in high school, I was a DJ. And I think that was one of my first, again, experiences being involved with events. And no one ever told me, like, none of my career counselors in high school were like, did you ever think about being a part of this multi-billion-dollar industry, which is people's favorite things that they do in their leisure time? But somehow I just kind of fell into it through various different circumstances. After I came back from UCLA, I dropped out and to go become a personal trainer, actually. And I was doing that for a while. And I ran my own business. And then I ended up working at the University of San Diego as a personal trainer and also as an instructor. I actually became an adjunct professor, which I was so proud of because I had dropped out of UCLA. And then I started working as part of the campus recreation staff, managing events that they had. And so I was doing stuff like managing a dodgeball tournament. I used to also brought in the catering experience. We used to cater these events for 500 students and doing all these kind of things. The dodgeball tournament, one of the things I loved about that is, like, again, thinking out of the box, like, how can you do little things to make people feel special? So I went to Home Depot and bought a wrench and I spray painted gold. And that was like the trophy for the people who won, which is a reference to the movie Dodgeball. If you could dodge a wrench, you can dodge a ball. So like, those were the things that I was learning. And then eventually I went back to school at Sacramento State, studied recreation, hospitality, and tourism there. And that's when I became an adventure guide. And I thought that I was going to go work as a park ranger. And so I studied natural resource management. But again, I think all of these experiences, you think you're at UCLA for one reason, because you want to study business economics, or I changed my major to Italian and French. And then actually I was there learning about becoming a chef, or maybe not a chef because I never went to culinary school, but working in the kitchen and being a part of events. When I was at Sacramento State and I was working on the adventure course as an adventure guide, but also working on the ropes course, I learned about facilitation, about asking people questions, about managing buy-in for groups. Like in events, people are always asking, like, how do we keep engagement high? Well, if you ever had to present a game to 60 fifth graders, then you learn some tricks about trying to manage buy-in and about energy, and also about like asking questions and engaging people in that way. So there was all these other lessons that I learned along the way. And then eventually I came back to San Diego, got a job working at the Hard Rock Hotel in San Diego on the events and kind of the sales and catering side. And then I was always just really fascinated with audiovisual. After about a year, I made a switch to go work for the AV company that was at the Hard Rock Hotel, because they were doing all the fun, cool stuff, the big concerts. They used to have this pool party on Sundays called Intervention. And so we had all these big EDM names like David Guetta and Benny Benassi and Nas and Waka Flocka Flame. And so those were the kind of things that I was really inspired about, and doing things like projection mapping and lighting design. And so that's kind of what has been my world for the past about 5 or 6 years.
That's awesome. I love it. Before I actually segue into the main question, I am curious though, when you're leading trips up the Half Dome in Yosemite, were you like rock climbing or just hiking up? I remember doing a hike, like, oh my gosh, like, I don't know, it feels like forever ago, but probably it was like 12, 13 years ago, where I hiked the Half Dome, and it must have been the longest hike of my life. Because I still remember it. I don't remember how long it was really, but I remember the trip itself, it just took forever.
Yeah, so I didn't lead any rock climbing trips in Yosemite. I do some rock climbing trips throughout the Sacramento area, but no, we would do either it would be a full day. We would leave at 5 a.m. and come all the way back if we were camping in the valley. Or a couple times we also did backpacking where you would hike basically, I think, about 7 miles up just past Nevada Falls, camp there, and then summit the Half Dome and, the whole cables, which is like straight up like this and really treacherous. And we would come back, stay another night, and then hike all the way back with backpacks and stuff like that.
So is it possible to do it in one day? Because I remember that was like one of those 18-hour super long days. And this is when I was kind of new at hiking and I signed up for it without knowing what I'm signing up for.
Yeah, again, like let's think about this again from an event attendee experience or user experience. So you have to understand that everyone who attends an event has a different ability and skill level. They have a different ability that they can engage with. So there are people who will bring just a water bottle and will jog all the way up to the top of Half Dome and jog back, and they can do it in 5 or 6 hours. And then there's people who they can't even make it all the way up to Half Dome. So I think that when you're leading a group of people, most likely, since they're paying to have an adventure guide and be a part of a group that does it, they're going to not only have varying levels of fitness and ability, but probably a little bit on the lower end. Like they're not hardcore, otherwise they would just probably go do it themselves. Yeah. So I think that that's part of the challenge too, is how do you bring up people in the rear and then also keep people happy who are kind of charging in the front. But yeah, I've done it in a day where it probably takes more like 12 hours or less, but it's I think 18 miles or maybe 20 round trip, somewhere like that.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly how many hours, but I just remember it was a very, very long day. And it's a good experience because I still remember it. Done millions of hikes since then, and I still remember that one. So that's good. That was probably a good experience. I remember being very tired, but that's a different story. But going back to this idea of user experience that I started with and the terminology behind it and how it's outputted in practice and how this has evolved over time. One thing that is for sure is that experience design, like you mentioned, it hasn't necessarily strayed far from its core competency, which is the user centricity. Like we're thinking about the user experience. We're thinking about what does the attendee, what does the person on that adventure or on that event is feeling. And for us moving into this hybrid world, I think that we must, first and foremost understand that our clients have different goals that may be what our attendees' needs are, and then map this journey that meets those needs holistically. So there's this bridge that can be formed between a virtual and a real life experience. Turning the question to you, how do we map the experience for our event so that we can bridge this gap in a way that the experience is high?
It's a really great question. I think there's a number of things I want to say about it. First is that if you look at historically over the past 10, 20 years, the way that events were planned out, a lot of times it would be 3, maybe 4-day conference. The second day would sometimes be 12 hours with a gala at the very end of it. So it's incredibly long, short breaks. The CEO wants to give a 2.5-hour address. No one can stay awake during it. And what we started seeing was that on the Friday, they would have significant attrition. People would leave early so they could catch a flight home and be home by Friday evening. And so what I think started happening was we started to see more of the 2.5-day events and then the 2-day events, and things starting to get compressed. And now with recent disruption towards virtual, people are rethinking the entire way that we're scheduling events. And they're saying, people can't sit through 8 hours in front of their laptop, which also begs the question, was that ever ideal for people in person to sit through an 8-hour event? So I think that we're starting to see things where sometimes the days aren't consecutive. It'll be a Tuesday and Thursday, or sometimes it's not even a consecutive week. It'll be Tuesday for 3 weeks. So there's a number of things that we're starting to see with that in terms of the attendee journey of how things are being scheduled. The opening keynote is super important, but also how do you get people to stay to the end? So having something that also packs a punch towards the end and the middle, giving people a reason within that first 30 seconds to 3 minutes of every session to want to be able to stay and not go to the refrigerator or to be distracted by something else. And the other thing that I think is really challenging, especially as we're moving more towards hybrid, people are trying to figure out how do you connect the in-person attendees with the virtual attendees, and how do you make sure that the virtual experience is also a really powerful, the ability for the virtual attendees to interact with each other, but also to interact with the in-person attendees. So these are all challenges. The one last thing I also want to mention is you're hearing this word community come out a lot right now. It's one of the big buzzwords right now, just in marketing in general. But I think also what that is alluding to is that what is the messaging and what is the value that you're providing prior to the event and after the event that keeps people engaged, not just for those 3 days of the main core of the sessions, but all of the other interaction that we know is really valuable and the analytics that are aligned with that.
Absolutely. And in this marketing frame of thinking, you want to make sure that you develop this target audience, right? Persona, like who's your audience? And then you try to map around that to ensure that every different touch point is thoughtful and personalized and engaging, and it allows to create this experience, but also identify some of the gaps in the user experience and determine when and where you need to maybe support, inform, educate, add some fun gamification elements to your event. Do you have a creative example or idea of how this concept of creating this user experience has been successfully implemented for the events that you've worked on?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that come to mind right now. I think one of the big things that I encourage my clients to do is, especially for vendors, but all content in general, is I tell them you need to create content, especially for advertising, that is like a Super Bowl commercial. So it needs to be funny. It needs to maybe have an element of surprise. It needs to give someone a reason to be like, wow, that was cool. And there's a lot of really great examples of that. But I think a lot of it comes back to like creating content. And if we're being honest, a lot of presentations historically have been boring and terrible, and they have not been user-centric. So another thing that I talk to people about is like, why are we always waiting till question and answer at the end? I'll answer your question at the end. And what does that tell the user subconsciously is that your questions are not important to me. And that if I get a chance after I am continuing to espouse for 40 minutes or for 50 minutes, that maybe I will get around to answer your question. So some of the things that I'm encouraging people to do is, there's also a lot of like technical challenges with how do you bring people on for question and answer. So you can be like, all right, no, go ahead and ask your question in the chat. And then you see people like trying to like read the question in the chat. And then it's actually secretly the staff member because no one is actually asking any good questions. So they're like,
oh, come on, that never happened to any event.
Exactly. So instead, what I'll say is like, okay, you need to ask in advance for people to film a question no longer than 20 seconds and submit it, and then play that. So now their video is brought on screen. There gives them a reason to engage with it. And also those questions might be insightful to the presenter about what's important to the audience. And they may be able to tailor some of the things in their presentation to it. So instead of just waiting to the very end, maybe start out with some questions in the first 10 or 15 minutes and find ways that you can put some of that content, mix it into the actual presentation, and just putting more media and content into the presentation in general, I think is super important.
Absolutely, yeah. Now, when I'm thinking of this idea of a frictionless event experience, I have this picture of a peanut butter and jelly sandwich because they go together so well, right? So what does that look like for our events, our hybrid events, the events of the future, the events of fall coming soon, and all of those events will turn to be some sort of rendition of what that might be like?
Back to the way things used to be, sometimes it would be the person who's the most important in the organization, CEO, is like, all right, everyone, I want you to put all your cell phones away for this next hour because I have my egotism that needs to be fed by your attention, okay? And I know that my content is not compelling enough for you just to pay attention without it. And you're going to pull out your phone and be responding to email, but I'm going to tell you not to, otherwise I'll fire you. And so like there was always kind of this speech that would go out. And what I'm telling clients now is ask your attendees to take their phone out. Ask your attendees to be engaging on social media. Ask your attendees to interact with people who are the virtual element. And I think that that is a huge paradigm shift for how do you coach maybe some of the people who are the most important within the organization. Like telling your clients to encourage that type of interaction is a huge learning curve. But when they understand the analytics that are involved with that, it's super powerful. So one of the other challenges now going back into live events is potentially losing a lot of this great data and rich analytics that we get from a virtual aspect. But if you're able to have some kind of an app that they're able to engage with that content that's happening live, it helps to reintroduce some of those analytics and those touch points for data for what sessions are people attending, how long are they actually being active and engaged and interacting with the app. And that is just super valuable. So when event organizations and clients and the CEOs and the C-suite executives understand that, I think that you can have a really powerful conversation about trying to get in-person attendees to interact with the online experience.
Yeah. So going back to the attendee journey and trying to marry that with this idea of a frictionless event experience, how do we give our attendee what they want before they even know that they want it?
Again, polling a lot of times is like reserved for during the session, when you probably could be asking people well in advance. It's even just really nice to be asked, like, what are the type of sessions that are important to you? What are the topics that are important to you? Like, oh my goodness, you care about my feedback and my insight? I'm flattered. And so I think that that's a really important element of it.
So leaning hard on that data and the metrics that come with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe even to help the audience understand that they're valuable and that they're acknowledged, like saying, this is a crowdsourced idea. We got a lot of great feedback from you, the audience, and that's why we're hosting these additional sessions about this. I think that those kind of things actually go a long way, but it's definitely a really interesting problem. There's this awesome group called Hot Doki Mazo, which I always bring these folks up. Hot Creative, I think, is maybe what they're called now. But they used to do this event for event planners and also for vendors. And the very beginning of the session, what they called an unconference, they would crowdsource all of the sessions for the event. So there was no agenda leading into it. And they would say, what's important to everyone here? And then they would write all these issues. And then people would say, okay, so which of these issues are the most important? And, there would kind of be basically crowdsourcing the topics. And obviously most events can't do that just because of the structure, but they probably could do some of the sessions like that, or they could do some of the roundtables that are crowdsourced ideas. And I think that is more valuable than just having great sessions. It also does some important signaling and messaging to your attendees that they're important.
Before we move any further, I wanted to give a quick shout out to our main sponsor, Trifan Events, which is a boutique event planning and production agency that will come alongside you, offering personalized event planning and technical support, strategic event design, production and technology management, and flawless execution for live, virtual, and hybrid events. The team at Trifan Events is passionate about planning and producing event experiences that get people involved with true moments of interaction, engagement, and co-creation, while offering white glove treatment throughout the entire planning process, enabling you to reach your event goals with the use of creativity, production tools, and event technology. To find out how Trifan Events can plan and produce your event become memorable, go to trifanevents.com.
Yeah. The excitement, with all those experiences that we're all looking forward to have again in real life has definitely brought up the realization that there's also excitement with the massive amount of new technology that has been happening, at least, for us, because we're in the tech space. Probably for some people we're like, no, thank you. Like, can we go back to like the simple, the easy?
But I think even for those of us in the tech space are like, oh, great, another of the 200 virtual event apps. Like, okay, yeah, I can't wait to demo this. Like,
So true, right? But I guess having all these tools at hand, what would you say is a way to create this type of, or design this type of cinematic that you mentioned, a memorable experience?
I always try to tell clients, look at companies like Apple, who just did WWDC yesterday, and Google, and companies like Oracle and NVIDIA and Intel, and companies that are doing that. Like, what are they doing to make their event look incredibly polished, clean, professional? And a lot of this conversation comes up when people say, like, we really want to do this live. And I'm always like, why does it need to be live? What it's like, I'm happy to do it live. We can broadcast this live. And a lot of times what I end up suggesting is that we do some, if not all of it, pre-recorded and then broadcasting that live. And there's some added benefits. That the first being, you can potentially do it in a live or in a professional video studio. And so the quality of the video image with the actual professional camera that has a shallow depth, so the background is slightly out of focus, but the image is super sharp and crisp. The audio quality is better. The audience, even like this beautiful layout that you have for the podcast, so the picture-in-picture with the awesome backdrop and the pre-roll, like, you are already leading by example with this podcast of how you can really have a high production value with the virtual event. Those are some of the things that I always tell clients is like, okay, if Apple is comfortable with doing their event, not live stream in the sense that this is actually being broadcast live as it's being shot, most, if not all of it, has been pre-recorded. And the other thing that a lot of these companies do really well is the transitions from one video to the next. And it's professional animations that a lot of times people are like, oh, we don't have any, money in the budget for a creative like that. But those are the things, including these graphic elements, that you have this beautiful layout for the podcast, that those are the things that it doesn't seem like it's engagement in the sense of, like, it's not a call to action. It's not a poll. It's not a question and answer. It's like, wow, this looks expensive. Like, I probably should be paying attention right now. So I think that those are some of the things when we talk about a cinematic experience. Also, when we do live events, there would be a lot of moments that would be video playback. Like the very first opening of the session would usually be like brand anthem video, like, oh, super cool examples of people working in the field and like inspirational things and music and high energy, like play the music loud, and a lot of times it'll just like go straight to the person who's presenting and there's no video pre-roll prior to it. And I think that those are the things, like, we have to get back to recreating live events in a virtual experience or in a hybrid experience, and just kind of like think about like, what were the magical things about events that made people want to go and that made people love them. The other thing is, like, live entertainment was one of the first things just to get axed right from the budget. We don't need an acoustic guitar player. We don't need a DJ. And I don't think that people realize how important those things were to everyone's like drinking at the bar and stuff like that. And there's just like someone playing music in the background. But that is like part of the magic and that buzz. Or I kind of refer to it as like pixie dust, like just sprinkle a little bit of pixie dust into the event to give it the incredible experience that people don't even realize that that's why they had so much fun.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And people, until you start explaining to them, like you just did, in words that make sense, like in pictures that they can envision, it's hard for them to understand. It's like, what do you mean? Like, we need graphics and we need intro videos and we need all this like magic, when it can just be like a simple Zoom. And it makes such a huge difference. It goes back to what we used to talk in the beginning. People don't get fatigue over watching hours and hours of Netflix because of all the additional graphics and catching attention that you just get from everything that flies on the screens. It doesn't have to be constant, but it has to be engaging enough where you're not going to fall asleep just looking at something, where we have this idea of Zoom fatigue for a reason, because none of that happens. But what I was going to try to pinpoint from everything you said was even this idea of pre-recording everything and then streaming it live. I love that because it's managing a lot of the risk. Right before our recording today, I had this meeting with for an event that's going to happen sometime in October. And their client is really pushing for having all these 50 something sessions, live sessions to be live. But problem with that is that they're all flash talks, meaning 5-minute presenters coming and going constantly for 40, 50 something sessions. And by the time you do the math, you realize there's a lot of people involved in those flash talks. And this is an international crowd too. Like we're talking about people coming from Australia and APAC and all kinds of places. This sounds to me like headache city, and it's not worth. Like seriously, it's not worth the liability you're taking with all the risk involved when you can pre-record a lot of those sessions and just play them live.
I'm cracking up over here. Like I couldn't relate more. And the other, yeah, it's expensive, especially if you want to have live concurrent sessions. Like you have to have a dedicated technician for each one of these experiences. So if people want to do like, we're going to do 8 breakouts or 10 breakouts, and they're all going to be live concurrent. And they're going to all be managed. It's like, wow, this is incredibly expensive.
And we also have a budget, by the way. I'm like, no.
Exactly. So whereas you can manage that in significantly by doing pre-records. So yeah, and when you're talking about like the liability or the potential challenges for some kind of a failure when it's doing everything live stream, especially like people don't think like, you're like, oh, well, I have this one keynote who all they do is professional speaking and like, they're the CEO of this organization or whatever. Typically, the higher they are within the organization, a lot of times they're like, oh, this is no big deal. I do this all the time. They stroll in maybe 5 minutes prior. So like it becomes a lot harder to manage them, to up manage someone who's a VIP. Whereas if you're doing the pre-record 2 weeks prior and then they're like, oh, something came up, I need to reschedule it, a lot less risk. You do all these instructions and you send out all these reminders and you're like, make sure that you are testing in the same location. And then like you get to the test and that's the day prior or 2 days prior. And they're like, this isn't even actually where I'm going to be at. So the lighting and the internet's going to be different. And so it's like, yeah, well, that's not really the purpose of the tech check. So one of the things that I think people are realizing is from in-person events, sometimes the rehearsals were kind of seen as being optional. And I think that we need to realize that for virtual events, they're actually really crucial. Yeah. And I'm hoping that this will translate when we go back to live events, that people will realize the importance of how tighter the transitions are, how much more prepared the presenters are when you do rehearsals and Q2Q tech checks.
Absolutely. And it's funny because we kind of covered a lot of things in this just a little bit that it was very much off the cuff, but those challenges that we mentioned and the opportunities that arise with hybrid and virtual events, they're also very much tied to budget, right? And I want to dive a little bit more into that to see if you want to add anything to it, because it's one of the main challenges for event organizers, because they're trying to price, events well in advance, where there's so many different variables that go into that.
Yeah, I mean, we could probably do a whole series of podcasts just about budgeting. And I think that some people think that somehow magically hybrid is going to be less expensive. And it's like really kind of like doing 2 events, maybe not quite twice as much. In some cases, maybe more, depending on the logistics and the concerns. There's a lot of different considerations, but a lot of the conversations that I have about pre-record are centered around budget. And it's like, let's even say that you're able to come under budget because you're doing things pre-recorded as opposed to live. Where can you reallocate that budget that may be beneficial? I think you do an incredible job with how you've leveraged content and social media. And so for people like you and me, this seems very natural. Like I'm LinkedIn, I don't want to say addict, but I'm a pro user. And also that I do these like little inspirational quotes that I share every single day. So like I try to force myself to be in the content creator mode. So I'm always thinking about what are those opportunities that organizations can repurpose content. Or let's say, okay, you're going to do a professional video shoot for your pre-record. Your CEO is going to drive a half hour or hour out to this place. There may be COVID compliance involved, all these kind of things. Why not also film a couple small little like addresses that could be used later? I was even telling somebody, I was like, have them bring a couple changes of wardrobe, and they could film like the holiday address where they're like, just want to say thank you everyone for your hard work. You could film it 6 months prior and reuse that content. Hey, we want to do a special thank you to all of our sponsors. You could even do one for each sponsor where you want to say XYZ company, we want to thank you so much for your business. We couldn't have done this event without you, and send that video sent directly to their email, embedded in the email. I think that there's so many opportunities to piggyback services that also could potentially open up some other kind of like marketing budgets and can contribute to the production.
Absolutely. I think opportunity is always there. What I think a lot of people, they either don't realize because they don't think outside the box, like you just explained. Also, they don't want to put the work into it, because the reality is it does take a little bit of work and thinking of like, okay, so this content that we just created, how can we repurpose it in how many ways, in how many different ways? How can we cut it and chop it and take just little sneak peeks out of this and use it for different marketing strategies or different avenues to still reuse it without abuse it, right? Yet it takes work, it takes time, but if you're going to pay for it, like you say, if you're going to pay for this whole production and do it right, then do account for the time that's necessary to repurpose all of that. And then you can stretch the dollar, and you can make sure that if you were on a budget and you paid this much, like right now, you're probably set for, I don't know, like 3 months of content. Because if you think about it, that's content that otherwise will still have to be produced no matter what.
Absolutely. The other thing I like to think about is back to food is like, what are the appetizers that you can give people in terms of content? So that's kind of my whole idea with this like coffee quotes, inspirational quote thing I share. It's like there is really like limited amount of time as opposed to a long format podcast where it takes a whole hour, like what we're doing right there. I can film it in less than 2 minutes. I don't have to really edit that much. Maybe I cut the beginning and the end off. I fire it off. But also it's really easy and a low time commitment for the people to consume it. And so I think there's a lot of great ways that people can just take their session, take one key sentence that's a highlight from it, add a head or a tail of like a animated video in and out. And that becomes something that's really easy for people to engage with on social media. And then you can have a call to action, sign up for next year's event.
Yeah, more. And talking about recording and the podcast, we're almost coming to time here, but any last words on how to use the technology and the production to create a more meaningful and lasting connections for our attendees?
Totally. I think that people are afraid they're going to lose people's attention, so they try to keep people as siloed on the event platform that a lot of times it's a significant investment. They're like, we paid for this virtual event platform, so we want to keep people on the platform. And I think that you should do strategies that drive engagement on the platform, 100%, utilize the technology on the platform, but also you need to find ways to move those connections off the platform and onto other platforms. So I mentioned LinkedIn. I'm a big fan of Twitter. Not everybody that attends your event is going to be, maybe they hate Twitter. They're like, Twitter's a dumpster fire. I would never log on to Twitter. So understanding what are the channels that your attendees are utilizing. Maybe it's Instagram. And maybe you really need to push harder for those kind of channels, and finding ways that you continue that conversation of the event platform. So, Clubhouse really blew up over the past 6 months. It seems like it's been dying down recently, but I think that was a great example of
I think that's because of me.
Because people are being vaccinated and they're, meeting in person again. Honestly, I think there will continue to be a strong use case for audio only communication in the future. Twitter Spaces is another great example of it. I think there was like some concern. People like, we don't want to force people to go on to Clubhouse. Like, we want to keep them all on this website, on our event platform. But that I think that there's some great synergy. Not only is it kind of capturing the hot thing right then. So like, again, you could say like, hey, we're doing a TikTok challenge. Do this hashtag. Make sure that you're engaging with us on TikTok. Where I think a lot of times people are hesitant to do those things because they're afraid they're going to lose their attendees. I think that's completely backwards. We need to think about how can we capture what that hot thing is right now to both drive people to engage with it off the platform, and also in the process, you might kick up a little bit of noise on that platform that invites the conversation back to your event.
Well, John, thank you so much for this enlightening conversation about experience design and how we can certainly marry food with experience design and learn some lessons.
Just one last thing I'll sneak in. Yeah, food was one of the reasons people went to events, and we just cut it right out. So we talk about things like, how can you send Chicago pizzas to all of your attendees, or everyone do Uber Eats with the same, we all do Chinese food, or we all do Thai food. So sprinkle on that.
And that in itself is an experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, where can people find you, John? You mentioned LinkedIn. Any other channels that you frequent that somebody can connect with you?
Yes, definitely connect with me on LinkedIn, and also I'm on Twitter. I'm very active, and feel free to reach out to me. We do a lot of blog content through our website at helloendless.com. And so, we're huge fans of using content to educate people and engage. So again, I thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I really enjoyed it, and I'm inspired by the work that you're doing. So this was a lot of fun for me.
Well, same here. Thank you so much, John. I actually learned quite a few things during our recording today. So I'm excited for when this is going to air out. So in the meantime, I wish you all the best, and we'll stay in touch. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and say bye to John. Connect with him on LinkedIn. That's where mine is at.
All right. Thanks, I appreciate you.
Thank you. Okay, friends. Well, this was it for today's episode. I hope that you took as many nuggets of wisdom as I did, and you're going to implement some of the knowledge that you learned today. Thank you for anyone that's listening. I am honestly humbled and honored that through the means of this podcast, we are able to impart knowledge and share experiences, and also provide information to anyone that is needing it. Whatever you're tuning in from, please do subscribe on your favorite listening platform and leave a 5-star review to make this podcast visible to more event professionals like yourself. If you'd like to connect with me, you can do so on Instagram, Events Demystified Podcast. That is the handle. We have about 3 followers, which is great. We're growing. So be the 4th. Also, I do receive your feedback via the email podcast@trifunevents.com. Have a fantastic rest of your day. Until next time, I look forward to connecting with you soon.